The baggage was already packed. Before a single cannon had fired, before a single man had waded into the cold water of the River Boyne, the king's servants had received their orders. Everything ready to move at a moment's notice. 23,000 soldiers watched their sovereign prepare his exit before the battle had begun. This was supposed to be his last stand. He had the better ground. His army held the high south bank of a river his enemy would have to wade across to reach him, uphill, under fire, in summer heat. He had 6,000 French regulars, professional soldiers of Louis XIV, veterans of European campaigns. His cavalry, drawn from the dispossessed Catholic gentry of Ireland, was by multiple accounts the finest arm on either side of the river. Contemporary sources confirm all of this. And still, the baggage was packed. So what happened? James II watched the battle from a hill 2 miles behind his own lines, gave one catastrophic order that handed everything to his enemy, and by early afternoon was riding hard for Dublin, leaving 23,000 men to fight without him. But here is what historians have never fully resolved. James II was not a coward by nature. The historical record is clear on this. He had fought with genuine distinction as a younger man, had stood firm under fire when other men broke, had commanded English fleets in battle, and been praised by contemporaries for his courage under pressure at the Battle of Lowestoft in 1665. Something changed. By the time he reached the Boyne at 56 years old, the man who had once been praised for gallantry gave orders his own soldiers never forgave, earning a nickname in their language that translates, in the most undiplomatic terms, as James the Shit. The chronicles record what he did at the Boyne, Archdower. They never fully explain what broke him. You will discover that the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, celebrated William's victory with the Te Deum sung in Catholic cathedrals across Europe because the politics of this battle had almost nothing to do with religion. You will discover that the most experienced soldier on the entire battlefield, a 74-year-old man who had served in 5 national armies and been made a Marshal of France, died not because he charged recklessly, but because his king had spent the entire campaign ignoring his advice. And when he finally rode forward to do something about it, he was recognized by the ribbon on his chest and killed within minutes. And you will discover that the battle commemorated every year in Northern Ireland is not the one that decided the war. The battle that actually broke the Jacobite cause killed 7,000 men in a single afternoon, and most people have never heard its name. To understand how a king with every advantage became Seamus and Chaka, and why that Irish nickname still carries weight 3 centuries later, we need to go back not to Ireland, but to the palaces of Europe, and the moment a French king's ambition made the River Boyne inevitable. To understand the summer of 1690, you need to understand something that almost no general history makes clear. The Battle of the Boyne was not a war about Ireland. Louis XIV of France had spent 2 decades systematically destabilizing European order. His armies had driven into the Rhineland, seized territories in the Spanish Netherlands, and expanded French power through a series of calculated aggressions that left his neighbors in a state of permanent, exhausted alarm. His revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 had expelled France's Protestant minority, the Huguenots, and sent a signal to every Protestant court in Europe that French hegemony would mean religious as well as political subjugation. The League of Augsburg, formed in 1686, was Europe's attempt to answer this. It united the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, Spain, and several German states in collective resistance to French expansion. What it lacked was England. William III of Orange had been fighting Louis XIV since he was 21 years old. In 1672, the year the Dutch call the Rampjaar, the disaster year, France invaded the Dutch Republic and came close to ending it entirely. William's response over the following decades turned the Dutch Republic's survival into a template for containing French power. When English Protestant nobles invited him to take the English throne in 1688, William's interest was primarily strategic. The English crown was, in his calculation, a tool. What mattered was what it brought with it. English naval power, English treasury revenues, the financial and military muscle of the most commercially developed economy in Europe. Bring England into the Grand Alliance, and Louis XIV could be fought to a standstill on multiple fronts simultaneously. Ireland, in this architecture, served as France's one viable backdoor to the British Isles. For James II, who had fled to France in 1688 after his deposition, Ireland was the staging ground for a counter-offensive. Supported by French money, French troops, and French advisors, James intended to use the Catholic majority of Ireland as a base of operations that would force William to divert attention and resources away from Flanders and the Rhine. Every soldier James held pinned in Ireland was, in Louis XIV's calculation, a soldier William could not send to Europe. This was the strategic logic of the Boyne. It had almost nothing to do with the River Boyne itself. Here is the fact that subverts everything most people think they know about this battle. Pope Alexander VIII, the head of the Catholic Church, was part of the Grand Alliance against Louis XIV. The Vatican had its own grievances against French power and its own reasons to want Louis contained. When news of William's victory at the Boyne reached Rome and Vienna, the Te Deum was sung in Catholic cathedrals. Jonathan Barden's account in the Irish Times confirms this directly. The idea that the Boyne was a simple confrontation between Catholic and Protestant, between two religious worldviews fighting for dominance, is a narrative that the actual politics of 1690 does not support. For William, Ireland was an obstacle. For Louis XIV, it was a chess piece. For the Catholic gentry of Ireland who would fight and die on the Boyne's south bank, it was something else entirely. A chance to reverse everything Cromwell had taken from them 40 years earlier. On the same day those men assembled by the river, Admiral Tourville's French fleet was fighting and decisively defeating a combined Anglo-Dutch naval force at Beachy Head in the English Channel. France temporarily controlled the sea lanes. Had Louis XIV exploited this naval window with an immediate invasion force, William's position in Ireland could have become precarious. He did not. By August, the Anglo-Dutch fleet had regained the sea. But for one extraordinary week in the summer of 1690, the fate of the European balance of power was being decided simultaneously on an Irish river and in the English Channel, and the two contests could not communicate with each other in time for either outcome to change the other. For 23,000 Irish Catholics waiting on the south bank of the Boyne, none of this continental architecture was the point. What mattered was simpler and older, a chance to reclaim everything Cromwell had taken from them. Picture a man who was once genuinely brave. Now ask what happens when that bravery runs out. James II was born on the 14th of October, 1633, the second surviving son of Charles I, the king who would be executed by his own parliament. James had grown up in exile, had fought in the French and Spanish armies, had commanded the English fleet at the Battle of Lowestoft in 1665, where he stood firm under heavy fire and was praised by contemporaries for exactly the kind of personal courage that his later career would systematically contradict. Britannica's account of his reign and the National Army Museum's assessment of his conduct at the Boyne note the same thing, in almost the same words. By 1690, James II exhibited a propensity to vacillate or panic that represented a sharp and puzzling reversal from the man he had been. What brought him to Ireland was the collapse of everything else. He had been deposed in 1688 with remarkable speed. His army deserted, his officers switched sides, and his son-in-law landed with a Dutch army that didn't even need to fight to take his throne. He fled to France. He was 56 years old and had no remaining options except the one Louis XIV offered him: Ireland. For the Catholic population of Ireland, James's arrival in 1689 had been something close to a divine intervention. Under the Cromwellian settlement of the 1650s, Catholic landowners had been systematically dispossessed, stripped of land, office, and legal standing, through a series of measures that had, over 40 years, transferred most of the island's wealth from Catholic to Protestant hands. James's 1687 Declaration of Indulgence had promised religious freedom. His Lord Deputy, Richard Talbot, the first Earl of Tyrconnell, had rebuilt the Irish army with Catholic officers and men, had purged the Protestant administration, and by 1690 had secured Jacobite control over virtually all of Ireland, except for the Protestant enclaves at Derry and Enniskillen. The Irish were not fighting for a king. They were fighting for land, for religion, and for political survival, a distinction James himself never fully understood and never particularly honored. The Jacobite army that assembled on the south bank of the Boyne numbered approximately 23,000 men, though contemporary accounts vary slightly around this figure. Its composition told a story of profound military imbalance. The cavalry, recruited from the dispossessed Catholic gentry, men fighting for what they had personally lost, was by multiple accounts, including Wikipedia's assessment, high caliber, and proved it repeatedly during the battle. The French regulars, 6,000 professional infantry provided by Louis XIV, were experienced and disciplined. The Irish infantry was the catastrophe. Predominantly peasant conscripts, hastily raised, many of them armed with obsolete matchlock muskets that were prone to misfire in damp conditions. Some carried farm implements, some carried scythes. Those who had genuine firearms were outgunned by the technological gap they were about to encounter. James had also, in a detail that captures the financial desperation of his position, partially melted down his own artillery to mint currency. Gun money, no. Bronze coins used to pay his troops when he ran out of silver. The Jacobite army arrived at the Boyne having already consumed some of the tools it needed to defend the Boyne. His French advisors saw this clearly. Lauzun, who commanded the French regulars, had recommended against fighting at the Boyne at all. The preferred French strategy was to abandon Dublin, burn it if necessary, fall back behind the Shannon, and force William into a prolonged war of attrition far from his supply lines. James rejected this. His reasons were real enough. Abandoning Dublin, the seat of his Irish authority, would have shattered Jacobite morale and surrendered the symbolism of the capital without a fight. He reportedly declared the Boyne the walls of Dublin. But alongside his decision to fight, James gave an order that says everything about his state of mind. Before the battle began, before a single cannon had fired, the royal baggage was packed and ready to move. His advisors knew, his soldiers could see it. A commander who prepares his retreat before his army fights has already made the most consequential decision of the engagement. Across the river waited a force that had made none of these preparations for failure. He was small, slight, and hunchbacked. Chronically asthmatic his entire adult life, his face carrying the permanent lines of a man fighting his own body every waking hour. He spoke Dutch, French, German, Latin, Spanish, and English, but he spoke English last and least comfortably of the six. William III of Orange was, by the physical standards of the age, an unlikely king. He was also, by 1690, one of the most experienced military commanders in Europe. Born on the 4th of November, 1650, in The Hague, his father died of smallpox 8 days before his birth. William had grown up an orphan at the center of Dutch political intrigue. He had been educated in 6 languages, steeped in the theory and practice of war from childhood, and shaped by the rampjaar of 1672. When France invaded the Dutch Republic and William, at 21, had organized its defense with a ferocity that became the defining act of his public life. What followed was 20 years of campaigning against Louis XIV. Not always successfully, but persistently, strategically, with the patience of a man who understood that this was a generational contest rather than a single war. Britannica's assessment is measured but clear. Contemporaries acclaimed William a great soldier, though he was not, in fact, a very fortunate general. What he was, consistently, was present. His character, by contemporary accounts, was cold, cynical, and ruthless in the political sphere, and sometimes irritable and ungracious in person. A product, his biographers note, of chronic ill health and overwork. Yet Britannica records that he had the gift of winning and keeping love. His soldiers trusted him for a specific, documented reason. He went where the danger was. At the Boyne, he would cross the most treacherous ford personally, get his horse stuck in the mud, require assistance from his own escort to reach the south bank, and continue directing the battle from the middle of the fighting. This was not theater. It was simply how he commanded. The army William had assembled at the Boyne was, in terms of raw multinational composition, something the island of Ireland had never seen. Approximately 36,000 men, though some accounts give 37,000. Roughly half were British, including English and Scottish regiments, and the Ulster Protestant irregular cavalry known as the Enniskilleners, described by the Williamite army chaplain George Story as traveling half-naked with saber and pistols hanging from their belts like a horde of Tartars. The other half was the Grand Alliance made flesh. Approximately 7,000 Danish professionals under General Ernst von Tettau, 6,000 Dutch, including the elite household infantry of the Dutch Blue Guards under the Count of Solms, approximately 3,000 French Huguenots, Protestant refugees from Louis XIV's persecution, men fighting against the armies of the king who had expelled them from their own country. The technological gap between this army and the Jacobite force across the river was substantial and documented. A large proportion of Williamite infantry carried modern flintlock muskets, faster to operate, more reliable in damp conditions, less prone to the catastrophic misfires that plagued the older matchlock system the Jacobites primarily used. The Dutch Blue Guards had also adopted platoon fire, a tactical system of rotating volleys that provided sustained rather than massed fire, filling the gaps between shots with disciplined pressure rather than reloading silence. Williamite artillery outnumbered the Jacobites by approximately 8-1, a disparity made worse, recall, by the Jacobite practice of melting down cannon to mint coins. Many Williamite infantry carried bayonets, making them capable of defending against cavalry without the need for dedicated pikemen. On the 14th of June, 1690, this army landed at Carrickfergus on the Irish coast. William joined Schomberg's existing 20,000 troops, bringing the combined force to approximately 36,000. Somewhere on that march south, William was heard to say of Dublin, "The place was worth fighting for." It was a remark that captured his strategic economy. He was not here for Ireland. He was here to clear an obstacle, return to Europe, and finish the war against France that was the actual purpose of his reign. What he encountered on the Boyne would be more complicated than he planned. From the moment William stepped ashore at Carrickfergus on the 14th of June, 1690, the march south had one purpose: force James into a battle he couldn't avoid. The advance was rapid and purposeful. William joined Schomberg's 20,000 troops already in Ireland. and the combined force moved south through Belfast toward Dublin, gathering Ulster Protestant forces as it went. James, watching this advance from the south, faced a strategic decision that his advisors debated vigorously and he resolved badly. Lauzun and the French commanders urged retreat. Burn Dublin if necessary, fall back to the Shannon line, deny William the quick, decisive engagement he needed. James refused. His publicly stated reasoning had some logic to it. Abandoning the Irish capital without resistance would cost him the political legitimacy his cause required. The Boyne, he reportedly declared, was the walls of Dublin. It was a defensible idea delivered with terrible execution. The River Boyne at Oldbridge was not the fortress its defenders needed it to be. Shallow, waist-deep at the main ford, and fordable at multiple points stretching miles east and west of the village, it offered no natural choke point that could compensate for James's numerical disadvantage or the equipment gap his army carried. The National Army Museum's assessment is blunt. James's decision to fight on the Boyne was a poor one, and the reason is visible in the terrain itself. A river that can be crossed in a dozen places is not a barrier. It is an obstacle course that a superior force can navigate at its own choosing. James positioned his army on the higher ground of Donore Hill, on the south bank, a genuine tactical asset that provided observation over the northern approaches and higher ground for artillery. His center was anchored at Oldbridge Village, where the main ford crossed, with hedges, breastworks, and the buildings of the hamlet fortified into a defensive line. 3 battalions of Jacobite foot were deployed further east at the Grove Island and Yellow Island fords. His cavalry, under Tyrconnell and Berwick, was available to contest any crossing. The French regulars under Lauzun were positioned in reserve, available to reinforce whichever point of the line came under most pressure. On paper, this was a coherent defense. The problem that neither side's scouts identified was waiting 4 kilometers west of Donore Hill at a place called Rough Grange. A deep, swampy ravine cut across the valley there, impassable for an army in battle order. Neither Williamite nor Jacobite reconnaissance had found it. Its existence would prove more consequential than any decision any commander made on the day itself. On the 29th of June, the Williamite vanguard reached the north bank of the Boyne. William's army took position on the elevated ground opposite the Jacobite line. Both sides could see each other clearly across the river. On the evening of the 30th of June, William convened a council of war with his senior commanders. His second in command, the 74-year-old Duke of Schomberg, proposed an ambitious wide encirclement upstream. A large flanking force that would cross the Boyne far to the west, swing around James's left flank, and threaten his rear and retreat route simultaneously. William rejected this as too risky, too susceptible to being caught and destroyed piecemeal. Instead, he chose a modified 3-pronged plan. Send approximately 10,000 men northwest toward the crossings at Slane and Rosnaree as a diversionary flanking feint. Launch the main assault across the ford at Oldbridge, and add a secondary cavalry crossing at Mill Ford downstream to the east. The feint would draw James's reserves. The main crossing would exploit the resulting weakness. The secondary crossing would complete the encirclement. It was a sound plan. What made it brilliant was what James did in response to it. On the day before the most important battle of his life, William III decided to eat lunch within range of Jacobite artillery. On the morning of the 30th of June, William arrived at the north bank of the Boyne, sent cavalry west to check the bridge at Slane, dispatched Dutch guards to scout the Oldbridge Ford, and then rode down to the river himself for a personal reconnaissance of the crossing points. His party, high-ranking officers, advisors, bodyguards, stopped at the riverbank to examine the Jacobite positions on the south bank. They appear to have decided, in a moment of either confidence or carelessness, to eat. in full view of the Jacobite camp. Alert Jacobite artillery officers spotted the cluster of figures and brought up 2 small cannons. The first shot exploded among William's party, killing 1 man and several horses. The second, an 8-pounder cannonball, ricocheted off the ground and struck William in the right shoulder. A contemporary witness, whose account has been preserved in the historical record, described the wound as tearing away the king's outer coat, his chamois waistcoat, and his shirt, and drawing blood from the king's shoulder. William was knocked forward over his horse's neck. His courtiers froze in alarm. Was the king dead? For a long moment, no one could be sure. Within hours, the rumor of William's death had traveled through both armies. It reached Dublin. It reached Paris, where the guns of the Bastille were reportedly fired in celebration and crowds burned effigies of William and his queen. In the Jacobite camp, soldiers celebrated into the night, many expecting no battle the following day. A different version of history is easy to imagine from this moment. One where the cannonball travels a few inches to the left, strikes William in the skull rather than the shoulder, and the Grand Alliance loses the man who assembled it. That version of history did not happen. The wound was minor. William's response to it was characteristic. He had his wound dressed by his close advisor William Bentinck, his arm placed in a sling, and then rode through his camp until late at night, appearing before unit after unit, demonstrating in person that he was alive and capable of commanding. His remark to whoever was treating him, reportedly simply, "No nearer," has been preserved in at least one account of the incident, though its exact wording should be understood as reported rather than certain. At 9 o'clock that evening, his arm in its sling, he convened the Council of War at which the 3-pronged battle plan was finalized. Schomburg Sr. argued, with the authority of decades of command experience, for the ambitious encircling sweep his instincts recommended. William declined it. The plan they adopted was less spectacular, but more controllable. Feint northwest with 10,000 men to draw Jacobite reserves, assault the main ford at Oldbridge with the bulk of the army, and cross downstream at Mill Ford with cavalry under William's personal command. Across the river, James's state of mind that night was documented in his behavior. He had already ordered the royal baggage prepared for rapid departure. Contemporary accounts record that he was acutely anxious about his left flank, fearful that William would find a way around him. He stationed himself on Donore Hill at a position that offered a commanding view of the northern approaches, but also, as it happened, a straightforward route of withdrawal to Dublin if the battle went badly. History Ireland's account of the eve of battle notes that James had given orders for the baggage to be ready before the first shot was fired. He was fighting a battle he had already, in some essential psychological respect, decided to lose. A wind from the north, stars over the Boyne, 60,000 men on both sides of a river, trying to sleep. Picture what 60,000 men looked like in that valley on the morning of the 1st of July, 1690. On the north bank, the Williamite army occupied the elevated ridge, its cannon positioned to fire across the river into the Jacobite defenses. Looking south, William's officers could see the village of Oldbridge on the far bank, a cluster of buildings, hedges, and hastily constructed breastworks manned by Jacobite infantry, with the hill of Donore rising behind it. The river between them at Oldbridge was, at its main crossing point, approximately waist deep. Not a raging torrent, not an insurmountable barrier. A wide, cold river that men would have to wade through under fire, holding their weapons and ammunition above their heads, with the current pressing against them and the Jacobite defenders waiting on the far bank. The landscape that shaped the battle extended well beyond Oldbridge. 6 miles to the southwest, at a place called Roughgrange, the river valley narrowed at a crossing near Rosenary. This was where William intended to send his flanking feint. The 10,000 men under Meinhard Schomberg, whose job was not to win a battle, but to make James think his left flank was being turned. 4 kilometers west of Donore Hill, in the valley at Roughgrange, the ground concealed something that changed everything. A deep, swampy ravine, cutting across the path that both the Williamite flanking force and any Jacobite response would have to travel. Neither side's scouts had found it. It did not appear in any intelligence report on either side. It sat in the landscape, invisible, waiting. Downstream from Oldbridge to the east, Mill Ford offered another crossing point, deeper than Oldbridge, with a swampy bottom that would prove difficult for cavalry. This was where William intended to lead his personal cavalry assault, the third prong of the attack, between Oldbridge and Mill Ford, at Grove Island and Yellow Island. 3 battalions of Jacobite foot were positioned to dispute additional crossings. The Jacobite deployment on the south bank made tactical sense within the constraints James faced. Tyrconnell and Berwick's cavalry were positioned to contest and counterattack any successful crossing at Oldbridge. The Earl of Clanricarde's infantry held the village and its fortified positions. The French regulars under Lauzun's were in reserve. Donore Hill, behind all of this, gave James elevation and observation. The problem, which the National Army Museum identifies explicitly, was that the position lay within an exposed loop in the river, vulnerable to flanking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Williamite 3-pronged plan was designed to exploit exactly this geometric vulnerability. The morning of the 1st of July brought mist, a lingering ground-level fog that partially obscured the north bank of the Boyne and provided cover for the first element of William's plan. At approximately 5 in the morning, before full light, 10,000 Williamite troops under Meinhard Schomberg began moving west along the north bank. Their departure was partly concealed by the mist. Their assignment was to find the Slane Bridge and the Rosnary Ford, cross the Boyne, and appear on James's left flank in sufficient force to make the Jacobite commander believe his army was about to be cut off from its Dublin retreat route. There was no possibility, given the ravine at Roughgrange, that anyone on either side knew what would actually happen when they arrived. At approximately 5 in the morning on the 1st of July, 1690, under cover of the last of the night mist, Count Meinhard Schomberg led 10,000 men west along the north bank of the Boyne. Guarding the Rosnary Ford against exactly this kind of movement was Sir Neil O'Neill with approximately 800 Irish dragoons. This was a cavalry screening force, not a serious defensive position. Its purpose was to observe and report, not to hold ground against an army. What O'Neill did with 800 men against 10,000 was not what his assignment required. He contested the crossing. He held the ford for over an hour. The disproportion between his force and the one it faced was more than 12 to 1. Warfare History Network's account of the engagement at Rosnary notes the tenacity of O'Neill's defense without romanticizing it. The Williamite force was too large and too well supported to be permanently stopped by 800 dragoons. What O'Neill could do, and did, was buy time. Every minute his men held the ford was a minute that news of the crossing could travel to James at Donore Hill and allow a response. The end came from Williamite artillery. A cannon shot struck O'Neill in the thigh, shattering it. He was carried from the field mortally wounded. He died that day. At this point, Warfare History Network observed something pointed about the nature of the Irish Jacobite force. O'Neill's men, faced with the loss of their commander, mounted up and yielded the ford. Their loyalty, by this account, was to O'Neill personally, rather than to the strategic requirement of their position. Without him, the rationale for continuing the defense collapsed. The Rosnary crossing was now open. Meinhard Schomberg's 10,000 were across the Boyne and moving south. The news reached James at Donore Hill around mid-morning, and what happened next was what William had designed his entire plan to produce, and what James's own psychology made catastrophically predictable. Believing the flanking movement to be William's main effort, believing his left flank was about to be cut off and his army enveloped, James ordered his best troops to march west and intercept. All 6,000 French regulars under Lauzun moved west. Most of his artillery moved west. Large contingents of cavalry moved west. By the National Army Museum's assessment, approximately 2/3 of the best fighting troops in the Jacobite army were now marching toward Rough Grange, toward the ravine that neither side knew existed. When Lauzun's 6,000 French veterans arrived opposite Meinhard Schomberg's 10,000 Williamites, the two forces found themselves separated by a deep, swampy ravine that no force in battle order could cross. Wikipedia's account is direct. The opposing forces there could not engage each other, but literally sat out the battle as artillery engaged. The finest infantry on both sides, Lauzun's veterans who had campaigned across Europe, and Schomberg's 10,000 who had come to threaten the Jacobite flank, spent the entire remainder of the battle exchanging ineffectual artillery fire across ground neither could traverse. James rode west himself, following his troops to the position where his best soldiers were doing nothing. He had abandoned the center at Oldbridge to whatever remained. What remained was Irish infantry, who had never experienced battle fire, cavalry commanders who understood exactly what was coming, and no French reserves to call upon. William's three-pronged plan had not yet required William to do anything except send a feint. The Jacobite center had already been compromised by the king's own decision. At approximately 10 in the morning, the Dutch Blue Guards waded into the Boyne. Williamite artillery opened on the Jacobite positions at Oldbridge around 10 o'clock in the morning. For the Irish infantry waiting behind the hedges and breastworks on the south bank, this was the sound of a technological gap arriving in person. The Dutch Blue Guards, William's elite household infantry, some of the finest soldiers in Europe, led the crossing 10 abreast at the Oldbridge ford, holding their muskets and powder above their heads to keep them dry as the waist-deep Boyne pressed against their legs. They moved in disciplined formation, closing the distance to the south bank in the teeth of whatever fire the Jacobite defenders could direct at men in open water. As they approached the midpoint of the river, the defenders in Oldbridge village and behind the hedges on the south bank opened fire. A Williamite soldier who was present recorded what it was like. The enemy did not fire until our men were towards the middle of the river, and then a whole peal of shot came from the hedges, breastworks, houses, and all about. That account has been preserved in military history records and represents one of the few genuine ground-level voices from the crossing itself. The Blue Guards took casualties in the water and kept moving. They established a bridgehead on the south bank and began the difficult process of forming up on the muddy riverbank while the fire continued. This was when the Jacobite cavalry responded. What happened at Oldbridge over the next hour represents the most intense fighting of the entire Battle of the Boyne, and it is documented in detail from both sides. The Jacobite cavalry, Tyrconnell's horse, the Irish Life Guards, Berwick's regiments, charged downhill from Donore with ferocity that multiple accounts confirm was genuine and repeated. The Duke of Berwick, James's illegitimate son, was personally in the fighting. Richard Hamilton led one charge with 60 men and returned with 12. The cavalry did not stop charging because the charges weren't working. They stopped when the tactical equation became mathematically undeniable. Against the Blue Guards' platoon fire, the rotating volley system that kept sustained pressure on approaching cavalry without the reloading gaps that a single massed volley created, the charges broke. The bayonets that many Williamite infantry carried allowed them to form defensive positions against horsemen without needing separate pike units. The Jacobite cavalry was, by every account, brave. It was also facing a tactical system specifically designed to defeat cavalry charges with infantry fire. But the cavalry achieved something. A Huguenot regiment was shattered by one charge, its survivors scattered and retreating back toward the river. It was a moment of genuine local success in an otherwise losing defense. Among the Jacobite officers in this fighting, one preserved moment from the historical record carries specific weight. Major Thomas Arthur, commanding the 1st Irish Guards, charged the Dutch position and, in the words of a Williamite eyewitness account, ran the enemy officer through the body that commanded the battalion he marched up to, before sustaining a mortal wound. He killed the man across from him and died in the same action. This detail is not heroic romance. It is documented. The Irish infantry at Oldbridge were not broken by cowardice. They were broken by equipment, training, and the weight of numbers that kept crossing the river behind the Blue Guards. More Williamite regiments were wading the Boyne every minute. Danes, English, Ulster Protestants, more Dutch. The bridgehead was growing. Meanwhile, the French commander Boisselot, directing Jacobite infantry at Oldbridge, left one of the few surviving accounts from the Jacobite side, preserved in the National Army Museum's records. His assessment is remarkable in its directness. Our Irish never experienced fire before, and that took them by surprise. I led them 3 times to the attack. The truth is that the enemy was stronger and their firepower heavier. A French professional officer, writing about Irish conscripts fighting with obsolete weapons against flintlocks and platoon fire. The analysis is clinical and confirmed by everything else the historical record shows about that morning at Oldbridge. The bridgehead was holding. The Jacobite cavalry was fierce, but could not break the Blue Guards' disciplined formations. The Williamite force on the south bank was growing with every passing minute. And then the Duke of Schomberg made the decision that would kill him. Frederick Hermann von Schomberg had served in 5 national armies. He had fought for Sweden, Portugal, France, Brandenburg, and England in a military career spanning more than 5 decades. He had been made a Marshal of France, the highest military rank in the most powerful army in Europe, before being expelled from France in 1685 because he was Protestant, and Louis XIV had decided that Protestants were no longer tolerable. At 74 years old, based on the birth year of 1615 confirmed in Wikipedia, he was the most experienced soldier on the entire battlefield at the Boyne. And William III had spent the entire Irish campaign treating him with what the Dictionary of Irish Biography describes as marked coldness, pointedly ignoring his advice, declining his tactical recommendations, making clear through a series of small humiliations that the old Marshal's counsel was not wanted. The Huguenot regiments crossing at Oldbridge were Schomberg's particular concern. These were French Protestant exiles, men expelled from France by the same revocation of the Edict of Nantes that had expelled Schomberg himself. He had served as their figurehead and protector, had told William the Huguenot soldiers were worth twice the number of any other troops. When a Jacobite cavalry charge shattered one of these regiments and sent its survivors stumbling back toward the river, Schomberg crossed the Boyne himself to rally them. Multiple sources, Wikipedia, the Dictionary of Irish Biography, the National Army Museum, and Warfare History Network among them, agree on what he said and what happened to him next. His last words, addressed to his Huguenot soldiers, were in French. Allons, messieurs, voilà vos persécuteurs. Come on, gentlemen, there are your persecutors. He was recognized in the melee that followed, identified by the blue ribbon of his Order of the Garter, the mark of honor that, in this context, functioned as a targeting indicator. Irish troopers surrounded him. He was sabred twice in the head. Cahir O'Toole of Ballyhubbock, named in 3 independent historical sources, shot him in the neck. Frederick Schomburgk died instantly. Some historians, including the Dictionary of Irish Biography, have noted the possibility that the fatal shot may have come from friendly fire in the confusion of the river crossing. A question the historical record cannot definitively resolve. What the record is clear about is that he died crossing a river to do what his king would not. At almost the same moment, in the same crossing, the Reverend George Walker died. Walker had governed Derry through the famous 105-day siege of 1689, a figure of enormous symbolic significance to the Williamite Protestant cause, and had come to the Boyne as an observer or participant, depending on the account. He was shot dead in the ford at Oldbridge. Two of the most significant non-royal Williamite figures on the battlefield killed in the same river, in the same phase, within minutes of each other. What Schomburgk's death achieved, beyond the personal tragedy of a remarkable career ending in a muddy river in Ireland, was a paradoxical outcome. His sacrifice worked. The Huguenot regiments rallied to their fallen commander. The Dictionary of Irish Biography records that William reportedly wept at news of Schomburgk's death and declared he had lost a father, though this detail should be understood as reported rather than certain. And with Schomburgk gone, William had no choice but to take more direct personal command of the battle's progress. The man his king had dismissed was, in his death, still solving the problems his king had created. William walked through his camp in the night to reassure his troops with an arm in a sling. Now he would cross the deepest ford himself. The King of England crossed the River Boyne with his horse stuck in the mud, his shoulder wound throbbing under its sling, and an army watching. Mill Ford, the easternmost of William's 3 crossing points, was downstream from Oldbridge and significantly more difficult. The river bottom was swampy, the water deeper, the approach more treacherous for cavalry than the main ford had been for infantry. William led his combined Dutch, Danish, and Enniskillener cavalry to this crossing himself, doing precisely what Schomburgk had done at Oldbridge, putting his body at the point of greatest tactical difficulty. His horse became bogged in the mud of the river bottom. He had to be helped across by members of his escort, one arm in a sling, shoulder wound days old. The National Army Museum records this moment without dramatization. Once across, William led his cavalry force against the Jacobite positions around Donore Hill, adding the third prong of the attack to the pressure already building from the Oldbridge bridgehead. The battle had become a convergence, and the Jacobite defense had nowhere left to compress. By midday, the Williamite bridgehead at Oldbridge had grown to substantial size. The Blue Guards had been joined by English, Scottish, Danish, Huguenot, and Ulster Protestant regiments pressing across the ford in a continuous stream. The Jacobite cavalry had charged and charged, had achieved local successes, had demonstrated throughout the morning that they were the finest arm on James's side, but could not dislodge the accumulating Williamite mass on the south bank. The Williamite artillery, vastly superior in number and operational since the French guns had mostly departed west with Lauzun, had spent the morning suppressing the Jacobite positions in Oldbridge village. Meanwhile, the friendly fire problem that plagued every engagement fought by a multinational force speaking 6 different languages had claimed its most ironic near victim. Warfare History Network records that William himself was nearly shot by a member of his own cavalry who did not recognize him in the confusion of the Mill Ford crossing. The man who had survived a Jacobite cannonball the previous day came within a second of recognition of being killed by his own side. Near Slane, approximately 2 miles from the battle's center, James received word around 2 o'clock in the afternoon that William's forces had crossed the Boyne at multiple points and were establishing themselves on the south bank. The flanking force was across. The main assault was across. William's cavalry was across at Mill Ford. The French reserves were sitting across a ravine they couldn't cross. The Jacobite center, stripped of its best troops by James's overreaction to the morning's feint, had been fighting alone since 10 o'clock. James gave the order to retreat. The National Army Museum's account of this moment notes that James's conduct throughout the battle had been dominated by fear of encirclement. The same fear that had sent Lauzun's French veterans marching west to sit in front of an impassable ravine. The retreat order, when it came, was not a tactical withdrawal to a prepared second position. It was not a fighting retreat to preserve the army's ability to engage again. It was the implementation of the decision James had been making since the baggage was packed the previous day. The Irish cavalry, faced with this order, did what the infantry could not. They fought a rearguard. The infantry largely did not. The most professionally executed military action at the Battle of the Boyne was performed by the losing side, and it saved 20,000 men. When James's retreat order reached the Jacobite line, the infantry responded in the way that undertrained, under-equipped soldiers respond when their reason for fighting evaporates. They left. Wikipedia's account of the Jacobite collapse is direct. Many Irish foot soldiers deserted immediately upon receiving the order, abandoning their weapons, their clothing, their formations. Men who had spent the morning behind breastworks firing at the Blue Guards simply put down their arms and walked south. The equipment they left behind told its own story. Matchlock muskets in the mud, Wicker's shields abandoned at the river's edge, the physical evidence of an army that had been outgunned before it was outfought. What the cavalry did was different. Dismounted cavalry and dragoons established a defensive position behind the walls of the Donore graveyard, a walled enclosure on a steep hill that provided a natural elevated position from which a small force could delay a much larger one. Warfare History Network describes this rearguard position precisely. It was an ambush point, a defensible place from which the Williamite pursuit could be slowed long enough for the main body of the army to clear the immediate battlefield and move south toward the River Nanny at Duleek, 5 miles south of Old Bridge. The road to Dublin crossed the River Nanny at Duleek Bridge. This bottleneck was exactly what the word implies. A compression point where thousands of men, horses, wagons, and artillery pieces converged on a single crossing. The potential for catastrophe was real. If the Williamite cavalry pursuit reached Duleek before the Jacobite rearguard could establish itself there, the main body of the army could be trapped and destroyed. The French infantry, who had spent the entire battle standing across a ravine from Meinhard Schomberg's flanking force without exchanging more than artillery fire, now performed the most useful service they rendered at the Boyne. Lauzun's veterans marched professionally to Duleek and held the bridge with the discipline of experienced soldiers executing a task they understood. Williamite cavalry using carbines fired on the retreating column as it compressed toward Duleek, but could not break the French professional rearguard. An Irish chronicler's words, preserved in Warfare History Network's account of the engagement, describe the Mill Ford crossing as the place where the one hope of Mother Ireland died. But the rearguard at Duleek kept that death from becoming a massacre. William's pursuit was deliberately restrained, and historians document 2 reasons for this. The first was tactical caution. The Jacobite cavalry had demonstrated throughout the day that it was capable and aggressive, and an over-eager pursuit into unfamiliar territory could be turned into an ambush by experienced Irish horsemen. The second was personal. Wikipedia notes explicitly that William was always disinclined to endanger the person of James, since he was the father of his wife, Mary. His enemy was his wife's father and his own uncle, one of the more peculiar family dynamics in the military history of the British Isles. Pressing James to destruction risked killing the man on whose fate his marriage was partly entangled. The result of the restrained pursuit was that the main Jacobite army, battered, demoralized, stripped of its infantry morale, escaped largely intact as an organized force. This was not nothing. It meant the war was not over. By nightfall, 20,000 men had crossed the River Nanny at Duleek and were retreating toward Dublin. The army survived. Its king was already gone. James II reached Dublin before his own soldiers did. That was not a coincidence. Immediately after giving the retreat order at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, from his position near Slane, 2 miles from the main engagement, where he had watched the battle from a hill while his army fought, James rode directly for Dublin. He did not remain with the cavalry rearguard. He did not coordinate the withdrawal toward Duleek. He did not stay to account for the men who were dying so the rest could escape. William, that same afternoon, had been in the river up to his saddle, horse stuck in the mud, directing the crossing personally. James, that afternoon, was on the road south. What happened when James arrived in Dublin is recorded in multiple Irish historical accounts, including Jonathan Barden's analysis in the Irish Times, which draws on historical sources. James encountered Lady Tyrconnell, wife of the man who had spent 3 years building the Jacobite army in Ireland, and reportedly told her, "Your countrymen, madam, can run well." Her response, preserved in the historical record, was delivered without apparent hesitation. "Not so well as your majesty, for I see you have won the race." James said nothing after this that the historical record considered worth keeping. He left Dublin and sailed from Duncannon to France within days. He never returned to Ireland. He would live another 11 years, dying in exile at Saint-Germain-en-Laye in September 1701, having made no further serious military attempt to reclaim his thrones. The Irish response to his departure was immediate, specific, and lasting. The soldiers who had fought for him, Bestux and whose comrades had died for him, gave him a nickname in their own language, Seamus and Chaka. Wikipedia's article on the Battle of the Boyne confirms this directly, as do the Irish Times, multiple historical accounts, and the standard scholarly literature on the period. In English, the nickname translates approximately as James the Shit. This is not a modern editorial judgment. It is what the men who fought for James called him in their own language immediately after he left. The sentiment was earned. History has attempted, in some accounts, to rehabilitate the decision. There were, in fact, strategic reasons why James's presence in Ireland served no useful purpose after the battle was lost. As a former naval commander, he recognized that the French victory at Beachy Head, won on the same 1st of July, old style, while the Boyne was being fought, had temporarily given France control of the English Channel. If Louis XIV exploited this naval window with an immediate descent on England, William could be threatened in his most vulnerable position. James returned to France to urge exactly this. Louis XIV declined. By August, the Anglo-Dutch fleet had regained the sea. The window closed, and with it, the last realistic moment of strategic opportunity for the Jacobite cause. But the Irish soldiers who watched their king ride south while they were dying at Donore graveyard did not have access to this strategic analysis. What they had was the evidence of their own eyes. Seamus and Chaka. 3 centuries later, the nickname has not softened. Of the approximately 60,000 men who fought at the Boyne on the 1st of July 1690, roughly 2,000 died. By the standards of the era, by the standards of the same week even, this was not a massacre. Casualty figures for the Boyne require the same transparency that all pre-modern battle statistics demand. These are estimates, not counts. No reliable primary source casualty list survives. Wikipedia's consensus estimate is approximately 2,000 total dead, with roughly 3/4 of them Jacobite. The National Army Museum gives Williamite losses as approximately 800 killed and wounded combined. Most sources converge on approximately 1,500 Jacobite dead. Historia magazine, comparing the Boyne to other engagements of the same week, makes the scale vivid. At the Battle of Fleurus, fought by French and Allied forces in what is now Belgium on the same day as the Boyne, approximately 17,000 men became casualties. The Boyne, by the standards of the 9 Years' War it was part of, was a modest engagement. 2 documented factors kept the death toll low. The skilled Jacobite cavalry rearguard prevented the Williamite pursuit from turning the battle's final phase into a rout. Most casualties in 17th century battles came during pursuit, and the Boyne's pursuit was both restrained by William's orders and impeded by the Jacobite professional rearguard. The abandoned Jacobite infantry was more fortunate than it deserved to be. What was not modest were the long-term consequences of those 2,000 deaths. Dublin fell without a fight 2 days later. 40 years of Tyrconnell's army building, of Catholic administrative reconstruction, of Jacobite political infrastructure across the island. All of it unmade within 48 hours of the retreat order. The psychological damage to the Jacobite cause, the departure of James himself, the loss of the Irish capital. These strategic consequences were disproportionate to the battlefield death toll in ways that have puzzled military historians ever since. The battle that actually broke the Jacobite army militarily was fought 1 year and 11 days later, at a hill in County Galway called Aughrim. Williamite chaplain George Story, who was present at Aughrim, wrote that from the high ground above the Jacobite position, the bodies looked like a great flock of sheep, scattered up and down the country for almost 4 miles round. That description, preserved in Story's account, refers to approximately 7,000 dead. The Jacobite army genuinely shattered beyond reconstruction in a single afternoon. Aughrim was the military death blow. The Boyne was the symbolic one. The symbolic usually outlasts the military. The Boyne is remembered. Aughrim is not. And the reason why, which the historical record documents with some precision, is not entirely flattering to how history decides what to commemorate. On the 3rd of July, 1690, 2 days after the Boyne, William III's army marched into Dublin. The city had been abandoned without a fight. The Jacobite administration that Tyrconnell had built over 5 years, the Catholic army, the Catholic courts, the Catholic Parliament that had met in 1689 to discuss repealing the Cromwellian land settlements, was gone. The capital of Ireland was in Williamite hands. The war was not. The Jacobite army retreated west, behind the Shannon, and regrouped at Limerick, a city on the river whose walls had seen sieges before and would see them again. William moved south and west, with approximately 25,000 men in August 1690, intending to end the campaign by taking Limerick. He had his field artillery, but his heavy siege cannon were still traveling south from Dublin with a light escort, moving along a road through the Tipperary countryside. Patrick Sarsfield, the cavalry officer whose reputation at the Boyne had been overshadowed by the broader Jacobite failure, knew the route. He led approximately 600 horsemen out of Limerick at night, guided by a local man whose knowledge of the terrain took them through the Silvermine Mountains on a 30-mile night march. At Ballinety, they found the Williamite siege train, the artillery convoy, approximately 16 cannon, and contemporary accounts describe over 150 wagons of ammunition, powder, and supplies, was destroyed. Sarsfield's rallying cry during the raid, preserved in multiple Irish historical accounts, was, "Sarsfield's the word, and Sarsfield's the man." William, deprived of the siege artillery that would have been required to breach Limerick's walls, abandoned the first siege of the city. It was the single most tactically brilliant operation of the entire Williamite War in Ireland, and it was performed not at the Boyne by the king's commanders, but afterward, by an Irish officer who hadn't given up. The war continued through 1690 and into 1691. The decisive military engagement came at Aughrim on the 12th of July, 1691, exactly 1 year and 11 days after the Boyne. 7,000 Jacobites died in an afternoon. George Story, the Williamite chaplain who was present, and whose account serves as one of the primary sources for this period, wrote of what he saw from the heights above the Jacobite position. Bodies scattered across the countryside like a great flock of sheep for almost 4 miles in every direction. The Jacobite army was destroyed. A second siege of Limerick followed, and the Jacobites surrendered in October 1691. The Treaty of Limerick, signed on the 3rd of October 1691, allowed Jacobite soldiers to join William's forces or to sail to France. Approximately 14,000 to 19,000 chose France. Estimates vary across sources, with Wikipedia giving the lower figure from the treaty provisions and other accounts ranging higher. They became the flight of the wild geese, Irish soldiers who would serve in the armies of France, Spain, and Austria for the next century, fighting for monarchies that were not their own, in countries that were not their home. Patrick Sarsfield led this exodus. He was killed by wounds received at the Battle of Landen in Belgium in 1693, fighting in the French Royal Army. Tradition holds that he died with the words, "Would it were for Ireland," on his lips, words that may be later embellishment in the nationalist literary tradition, but that the historical record confirms captured something true about how he had lived. He died in Huy, Belgium. He is buried there still. The Irish who had crossed to France as the wild geese carried their exile into the next generation. Those who remained carried something else. The Treaty of Limerick ended the war. The Irish Parliament ended the treaty. The civil articles of the Treaty of Limerick had guaranteed Roman Catholics the right to exercise their religion and retain their property, provided they swore allegiance to William and Mary. These were formal treaty commitments, made in a signed document at the conclusion of a military campaign. The Protestant-dominated Irish Parliament, a body with everything to gain from those promises remaining unmet, representing a landholding class that had benefited directly from the Cromwellian settlement and stood to benefit further from Jacobite defeat, began systematically dismantling them within years of the treaty signing. The legislation that followed was not a single act, but a cumulative body of measures that historians of Irish law refer to as the penal laws. The Act for Better Securing the Government, passed in 1695, disarmed the Catholic population and specifically prohibited Catholics from owning a horse worth more than £5. A precise economic restriction targeting the cavalry-capable gentry, ensuring that the class that had produced Tyrconnell's horse and Sarsfield's dragoons could not reconstitute itself. The Act to Restrain Foreign Education, also passed in 1695, forbade Catholics from teaching in schools or sending children abroad for Catholic education, targeting the intellectual infrastructure of the community as deliberately as the military restrictions targeted its physical capacity for resistance. The Banishment Act of 1697 systematically removed the Catholic hierarchy from Ireland. Bishops, archbishops, and religious orders expelled, an attempt to eliminate spiritual leadership and organized Catholic institutional life. The most consequential single measure was the Popery Act of 1703. It mandated that Catholic estates, upon a landowner's death, be divided equally among all surviving sons. A deliberate subversion of primogeniture, the inheritance system that had allowed Catholic gentry families to maintain consolidated estates across generations. there was an exception. If the eldest son converted to Protestantism, he could inherit the entire estate intact under the normal rules. This mechanism, inheritance by conversion, as historians have termed it, was elegantly designed. It did not require force or confiscation. It simply made poverty the price of remaining Catholic and rewarded families for dissolving themselves or from within. The effect was documented and devastating. Catholic land ownership in Ireland had stood at approximately 22% in 1688, at the beginning of the Williamite War. By the mid-18th century, it had fallen to less than 5%. The reference documents analysis of this period, drawing on Irish historiographical sources, confirms this specific figure. The Disenfranchisement Act of 1728 completed the political architecture by formally stripping Catholics of the right to vote, a right that had been practically inaccessible for decades, but was now legally extinguished. The Protestant ascendancy, the minority political class that these laws created and sustained, controlled Irish land, institutions, and law for over a century. It shaped the conditions in which the Great Famine of the 1840s occurred, in which the 1816 Rising took place, in which the partition of Ireland was negotiated in 1922. The line from the Boyne to the world that Ireland would inhabit for the next 300 years runs through the penal laws in a direction that is historically documented and politically consequential in ways that have not yet fully resolved. All of it traces back to the morning of the 1st of July, 1690, and to the decisions made by two kings on the banks of a river in County Meath. Here is a fact that most people who know anything about the Battle of the Boyne do not know. The Boyne is not the most important battle of the Williamite War in Ireland. Aughrim is. The Battle of Aughrim, fought on the 12th of July, 1691, was the genuine military end of Jacobite Ireland. 7,000 Jacobites died in an afternoon. The Jacobite army was shattered beyond reconstruction. The subsequent siege and surrender of Limerick and the flight of the wild geese were the direct consequences of what happened at Aughrim. The Boyne killed approximately 2,000 people and allowed the Jacobite army to escape largely intact to fight for another year. By purely military analysis, Aughrim decided the Williamite War. The Boyne was a significant strategic victory that opened Dublin. Aughrim was the end of the war. So why is the Boyne commemorated every year across Northern Ireland with massive parades, bonfires, and the ceremonies of the Orange Order? While Aughrim is known only to historians and the communities in County Galway where it was fought, the answer involves calendars, politics, and something more uncomfortable. Wikipedia's account of the Battle of Aughrim addresses this question directly, and the explanation it offers deserves to be stated precisely. The Orange Order, founded in 1795 amid sectarian violence in County Armagh, originally commemorated multiple dates from the Williamite War. Aughrim fell on the 12th of July in the old-style Julian calendar. When Britain and Ireland adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, dates were adjusted, and in the process of conversion and combination, the Boyne, which had been fought on the 1st of July Old Style, absorbed the Aughrim commemoration under the 12th of July date that Aughrim had held. Over time, the Boyne replaced Aughrim as the focal point of the tradition. But Wikipedia's article on Aughrim offers an additional explanation that goes beyond calendrical confusion. It notes that historians have suggested the Boyne was elevated in Protestant commemorative tradition over Aughrim, partly because the Boyne's narrative could more easily present the Irish troops as cowardly. This is a claim about historical memory as propaganda rather than documentation, and it requires careful handling. At Aughrim, The Irish Jacobite infantry fought with such ferocity that Williamite observers praised them explicitly. Sources from both sides agree they fought with exceptional courage before the battle was lost. At the Boyne, the Irish infantry's performance was, by any objective assessment, poor. They were outgunned, undertrained, and broke quickly when the retreat was ordered. The distinction between broke because they were cowardly and broke because they were peasant conscripts with scythes facing professional infantry with flintlocks and bayonets was not one that commemorative tradition found it convenient to maintain. The Boyne could be told as a story of inevitable Protestant victory over inferior opponents. Aughrim could not, because the opponents at Aughrim fought too well. What this means, in plain terms, is that the commemoration of a battle on the 12th was shaped partly by which battle's aftermath permitted the most unflattering narrative about the people who lost. That is not a neutral act of historical memory. It is a selection. For the Unionist and Protestant communities of Northern Ireland who march on the 12th, the Boyne represents something real and culturally significant. A founding moment of Protestant constitutional government, a deliverance from what they understood as Catholic absolutism, a day when their community's survival was secured. For Irish Catholics and nationalists, the same date represents the beginning of the penal laws, the destruction of the Treaty of Limerick's promises, and a century of dispossession that the Boyne's modest death toll in no way predicts. The same river, the same morning, two entirely different histories, each of them true, neither of them complete. Historical memory is not a neutral recording of what happened. It is a selection, shaped by who controls the narrative and what that narrative needs to say. The Boyne has been selected, shaped, and instrumentalized for 300 years. Understanding what actually happened on the 1st of July 1690 requires setting down what the commemoration needs it to have been and looking at the river as it was. A shallow ford in County Meath, crossed by 60,000 men in 6 languages, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with what those men were told they were fighting for. The Battle of the Boyne is not studied in military history because it was a tactical masterpiece. It is studied because it demonstrates, with unusual clarity, the difference between a commander who fights the battle his enemy expects and a commander who does not. William's 3-pronged plan was not elegant in execution. It left 10,000 men sitting across a ravine from the French reserves for the entire battle, which was not the intended outcome of the flanking feint. What made it brilliant was the simple observation it was built upon. James II would react to a flanking threat with disproportionate force because James was afraid of being encircled. William designed a plan that exploited that specific psychology. He did not need to predict James's tactics. He had watched James make the same decision, the baggage prepared before the battle, the defensive position chosen over the offensive maneuver, the constant backward glance toward the retreat route. For every day of the campaign since he had arrived in Ireland, the flanking feint worked not because it was cleverly concealed, but because James's decision-making process was already written in his behavior. The National Army Museum's analysis of James's conduct at the Boyne identifies precisely this dynamic. Fear of being trapped was to dominate his conduct of the battle. A commander dominated by the fear of what might happen cannot effectively respond to what is happening. When Meinhard Schomberg's 10,000 appeared threatening the Jacobite left, James responded not to the evidence available. 800 of his dragoons had held that crossing for over an hour against 10,000. The threat was being contained. But to the catastrophic scenario his imagination had already constructed. He sent his best troops to chase a phantom and left his center to face the real assault without them. the battle also demonstrated something about combined arms that the National Army Museum identifies as a key factor in the Williamite victory. William's army could hold ground with platoon fire and bayonets, exploit openings with cavalry, and suppress defenders with superior artillery. No single element won the Boyne. Every arm supported the others. The Jacobites had excellent cavalry, which proved it repeatedly. They had experienced French infantry, which spent the battle idle. They had Irish infantry that was outgunned and undertrained. And crucially, the mismatch between what they had and where it was needed was a consequence of James's overreaction to the feint. The best troops ended up at Rough Grange. The worst troops ended up at Old Bridge. This is not a failure of Jacobite military theory. It is a failure of command decision under pressure. What the historical record reveals, when you set the two commanders side by side across the narrative of the 1st of July, is a distinction that goes beyond tactics into something harder to name. William crossed the deepest ford himself, horse stuck in the mud, arm in a sling, directing his cavalry from the middle of the crossing. Schomberg, 74 years old, rode into the river to rally men his king had dismissed, and died doing it. On the Jacobite side, Sir Neil O'Neill held a ford with 800 men against 10,000 until a cannon shot killed him, and his men yielded the crossing when he fell. Richard Hamilton led 60 cavalry in a charge and came back with 12, then went back again. Major Thomas Arthur killed the officer across from him while receiving the wound that killed him. The Irish cavalry held the rearguard at Donore Graveyard and the Duleek Bridge, while the army escaped. Personal courage was not absent from the Jacobite side. What was absent was something the National Army Museum identifies in institutional terms and Britannica identifies in behavioral terms. The willingness to make decisions under uncertainty, to stay with your army when the alternative is a comfortable retreat route, to commit to an outcome rather than a contingency plan. William stuck in the mud is a better commander than James on Donore Hill, not because he was physically more courageous, but because he was present. Leadership in battle is, among other things, a geographical fact. You cannot lead from the direction of Dublin. Every military academy that teaches the Boyne teaches it as a case study in what happens when operational deception meets a commander who has already psychologically conceded the battle. The trenches at Old Bridge have long been reclaimed by the river, but the principle is still taught. The baggage was packed before the battle started. 60,000 men, 2 kings, 6 languages, 1 shallow river in County Meath. Approximately 2,000 dead, roughly 1,500 of them Jacobite, 500 Williamite, husbands, fathers, sons, brothers. Sir Neil O'Neill, who held a ford with 800 men and died for it. Major Thomas Arthur, who killed the man across from him and died in the same second. The Huguenot soldiers who rallied to Schomberg's body after he fell into the river trying to save them. The Irish cavalry who held the graveyard walls at Donore while their king was already on the Dublin road. What the Boyne changed was not, in the end, what most people think. It did not end the war. Aughrim did that a year later and 4 miles away from any road most people have heard of. It did not end Catholic Ireland. The penal laws did that, slowly, in parliamentary sessions over the following decades, with votes rather than cannon. What the Boyne changed was the structure of European power. William III's victory secured England for the Grand Alliance against Louis XIV. The English financial revolution that followed. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694. The ability of the English state to borrow enormous sums at low interest rates to fund sustained military campaigns gave the anti-French coalition the economic foundation it needed. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, which contained French expansion and marked the effective defeat of Louis XIV's ambitions for European hegemony, was made possible by the resources that flowed from an England secured at the Boyne. That is the battle's largest historical consequence. Not the Orange Marches, not the penal laws, not even the fate of Ireland, but the European balance of power for the next century. The battlefield at Oldbridge is now a visitor center and parkland on the south bank of the River Boyne in County Meath, operated by Ireland's Office of Public Works. You can walk the ground where the Blue Guards crossed, where Hamilton's cavalry charged and came back with 12 men from 60, where Schomberg fell into the water with a ribbon on his chest. A stone marks the approximate spot of his death. The river is still there, still shallow at the ford. There is no stone for Sir Neil O'Neill at Rosnaree. James II died in exile at Saint-Germain-en-Laye in September 1701, 11 years after the Boyne. William III died in March 1702, thrown from a horse that stumbled on a molehill in the grounds of Hampton Court. In certain Jacobite circles, that molehill was toasted for decades afterward as the little gentleman in the black velvet coat, a piece of political gallows humor that captured, in its own way, what the Jacobite cause had become. A thing that survived as tradition after it had ceased to be a military possibility. 2 kings, 1 river, 1 morning in the summer of 1690. The historical record does not give either of them exactly the verdict they would have chosen. James II wanted to be remembered as a martyr. He is remembered as Seamus and Shaka. William III wanted to be remembered as the defender of European liberty. He is remembered in Northern Ireland on lampposts and in banners, and barely remembered at all outside it. What the Boyne gives us, if we are willing to look at it without the filter of 3 centuries of commemoration, is something simpler and more instructive than any of the myths built around it. A river that can be crossed in a dozen places is not a fortress. An army whose king has packed his bags before the first shot is fired is not an army that believes in itself. And a commander who is still there, in the river, arm in a sling, horse stuck in the mud, directing his cavalry across a swampy ford, is a commander whose army knows he has not already decided to lose. The River Boyne still runs past Oldbridge at exactly the depth it was on the 1st of July, 1690. Waist deep at the ford, cold, even in summer, indifferent to which king was watching from which hill. Some things only need to be crossed once to change everything that comes after.